Ma'am, keep your mouth shut and face the wall, Deputy Travis Cole said, snapping the steel cuff around Dr. Naomi Bennett's right wrist, while rainwater slid down the porch columns of the house she had owned for 11 years. You can explain yourself after we verify who you are. Naomi stood barefoot on her own front porch in a gray house dress and a dark cardigan, one hand already pinned behind her back, the other still damp from where she had been rinsing collard greens in her kitchen sink 30 seconds earlier. Blue lights pulsed across her hydrangeas, her brick walkway, and the stunned face of the white woman next door who had made the call in the first place. Naomi did not raise her voice. That was the first thing the officers noticed. The second was that she never once said, "This can't be happening." She looked at Deputy Cole, then at the younger officer by the steps, then at the neighbor clutching her robe shut against the rain like righteousness needed a belt. This is my house, Naomi said evenly. My name is Dr. Naomi Bennett. The deed is recorded in Fulton County. My driver's license is in my kitchen on the counter because I was cooking dinner. You have no lawful basis to put me in restraints. The neighbor, Cheryl Whitmore, folded her arms tighter. That is not what I told dispatch. Naomi turned her head just enough to look at her. No, she said. You told them what you needed them to hear. Deputy Cole tightened the cuff another notch. Across the property line, porch lights came on one by one. Curtains shifted. Phones began to rise. Then Naomi looked past the officers, straight at Cheryl Whitmore, and said the sentence that emptied the color from the woman's face. Since you're so committed to this lie, stand still and listen carefully when I call Governor Ellis. The silence that followed lasted about 2 seconds. The rain kept falling. Deputy Cole gave a short laugh. The governor. Naomi did not blink. Yes. What Cheryl Whitmore did not know, not yet, was that the black woman she had just reported as a suspicious intruder in her own home was the chair of the governor's Police Accountability Commission and one of the few people in the state whose number he answered himself. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. At 6:14 that morning, Dr. Naomi Bennett had been standing in her kitchen with a ceramic mug of coffee warming both hands, while dawn spread pale gold across the counters and the house settled around her in its familiar chorus of small sounds. The vent above the stove hummed softly. A floorboard near the pantry clicked when the heat came on. Rain tapped at the back windows in a patient, steady rhythm that made the whole house feel held. Naomi liked those sounds because they belonged to a life she had built on purpose. She was 52 years old, dark-skinned, elegant without trying to be, with silver beginning to thread through her close-cropped curls, and a face people often described as calm, when what they really meant was disciplined. She had spent most of her adult life learning how to carry authority in rooms that preferred to borrow it from her and deny having done so afterward. She had been a civil rights attorney, then a federal prosecutor, then dean of a law school, most of the state's judges liked to mention whenever they introduced her. Now she split her time between teaching, advising, and chairing the Governor's Commission on Public Integrity and Police Standards, a title long enough to bore most people until they needed what it meant. What it meant was this: Naomi Bennett knew exactly how institutions lied when frightened. Her house sat on a quiet street in Brookhaven Heights, a neighborhood old enough to have mature trees and new enough to have arguments every month about preserving character. Naomi had bought the place 11 years earlier after her divorce, when the mortgage still felt slightly obscene and the front yard looked like a tired apology. She had planted the hydrangeas herself, had repaired the back fence, had sanded the original oak floors one summer with her son when he was home from college and determined to turn manual labor into a personality. Now the house fit her the way certain clothes fit after years of washing. Not flashy, certain. She took a sip of coffee and looked at the yellow legal pad on the counter where she had written out the day's schedule in blue ink. Lecture revision, call with legislative council at 10, meeting with Governor Ellis at 2:30, dinner ingredients thaw by 4. Her daughter Asha called at 6:22 on her drive to the hospital. Asha was 28, a pediatric resident with her mother's eyes and none of her patience for administrative nonsense. You're awake, Asha said. I'm older than you. We've discussed this. Asha laughed. You have the commission meeting today? Briefing first. Then a conversation with a governor who would prefer every problem to come to him already solved. Ambitious of him. Naomi smiled into her coffee. That's why he keeps lawyers around. They talked for 6 minutes. About work. about whether Asha was coming Sunday for dinner, about whether Naomi's grandson, Malik, was still insisting that all adults over 50 should be called Captain out of respect. Small things, the kind that form the invisible beams of a life. After the call, Naomi pulled collard greens from the refrigerator, set chicken thighs in a bowl to marinate, and turned on old jazz, low enough that it felt less like music than company. Cooking on weeknights was one of the rituals that kept her body convinced it still belonged to itself. Chop, rinse, season, stir, order where the world had not asked for her opinion. By 8:30 she was dressed for the day in a navy suit and low heels, standing before a room of second-year law students in one of Emory's older lecture halls, explaining the difference between power and legitimacy. Power, she said, writing the word in clean black strokes across the board, is the ability to compel behavior. Legitimacy is the reason people obey without compulsion. Systems collapse when they mistake one for the other. A young man in the third row raised his hand. Professor Bennett, are you saying people don't trust institutions because they're corrupt or because they're careless? Naomi capped the marker. I'm saying corruption is often just carelessness that found protection. That line stayed with 3 students long enough to write it down and one long enough to quote it later on social media, which was how Naomi knew she had landed it properly. The meeting with Governor Ellis at 2:30 was in his Capitol office, not because he enjoyed ceremony, but because he trusted walls he didn't have to leave. Martin Ellis had been governor for 3 years and still looked slightly surprised by the size of the office every time Naomi saw him there. Late 50s, careful smile, reputation for moderation that had survived mainly because he let other people do the louder parts of the job. He respected Naomi, which was not the same as always liking what she said. She sat across from him at a polished table while rain streaked the tall windows behind his desk. The union is going to hate the recommendations, he said, flipping through the commission draft. The union hated the data, Naomi replied. The recommendations are just what the data requires. He exhaled through his nose. Mandatory body cam audit trails, independent review for force complaints, civilian subpoena power. You know what they're going to call this. Yes, Naomi said. They'll call it hostile because accountability always sounds hostile to people who've mistaken discretion for immunity. Martin Ellis looked up and gave the smallest unwilling smile. You practice those lines on purpose? I teach for a living. Everything is rehearsal. He set down the report. Naomi, I'm asking politically. Can I get this through the Senate? She held his gaze. That depends. Are you trying to pass reform or just survive the headline cycle? The silence that followed lasted about 3 seconds. Then Ellis leaned back in his chair and said, You know, most people I work with answer the question I asked. Most people you work with want things from you. And you don't? I want functioning institutions. You're just in the room where some of that gets decided. That was why he trusted her. Naomi Bennett had no appetite for decorative honesty. She spoke plainly, documented carefully, and never confused access with deference. By the time she left the Capitol, the rain had thickened into the kind of gray spring downpour that made highways shine like black ribbon under headlights. Naomi drove home through Atlanta traffic with jazz, low on the radio and the governor's marked up commission draft on the passenger seat. She stopped once for groceries, once for gas, and once at the florist, because Asha had mentioned Sunday dinner, and Naomi did not believe in receiving family without fresh flowers on the table if she could help it. She pulled into her driveway at 541. Brookhaven Heights looked the way expensive neighborhoods always looked in rain. Trim hedges, quiet driveways, porch lights warming up early, all of it trying to suggest permanence. Naomi carried in 2 grocery bags, shook water from her umbrella on the front mat, and went straight to the kitchen. The house smelled faintly of lemon oil and the lavender candle she had burned that morning. She changed out of her work clothes into a soft gray dress and a cardigan, set rice on the stove, and began washing collard greens 1 leaf at a time under cold running water. On the counter beside the sink sat her reading glasses, her phone, and her driver's license, which she had taken out of her purse earlier to update an online delivery form and never slipped back into the wallet. At 6:12, her neighbor Cheryl Whitmore saw movement through Naomi's front window. Cheryl had moved in 2 years earlier with a husband who traveled constantly. A ring light visible through her upstairs office window at odd hours, and the particular energy of a woman who treated neighborhood group emails like moral stewardship. Early 40s, blonde in the salon, maintained way that required appointments and conviction. Pleasant in public, if public involved witnesses. Less pleasant when it didn't. Naomi had known from almost the first month that Cheryl disliked being unable to place her. That was the thing about certain kinds of prejudice. It grew restless in the presence of black people who did not behave like the categories already prepared for them. Cheryl had asked Naomi twice what her husband did before Naomi reminded her calmly that there was no husband. She had once referred to Naomi's son's college friends as those boys after they parked 3 cars on the street during Thanksgiving. She had complained to the HOA about late-night gatherings that turned out to be Naomi's monthly faculty book club, ending at 8:40. Nothing explicit enough to prosecute, everything clear enough to understand. That evening, Cheryl had been standing in her front room in a silk robe, wine glass in hand, looking through half-open blinds at the rain when she noticed Naomi's front door open, then close. Saw the kitchen light, saw a silhouette moving back and forth inside the house in soft clothes rather than a work suit. Saw perhaps what she wanted to see rather than what was plainly there. At 6:17, she called 911. She reported a suspicious woman inside the Bennett residence. Said the homeowner, an older lady who usually dressed professionally, was not home yet. Said the person inside looked like she'd let herself in. Said she was concerned about burglary because the neighborhood had changed. That last word carried more freight than dispatch noted on the call. 2 county deputies arrived 8 minutes later because rain slowed traffic and because systems often made time for certain kinds of fear faster than others. Deputy Travis Cole was 36, broad through the chest, comfortable in uniform and already slightly soured by a divorce and a career that had taught him to confuse suspicion with instinct. The younger deputy with him, Miguel Ramirez, was 27 and still knew enough to notice when things felt wrong before hierarchy taught him to ignore it. Cheryl met them under her umbrella halfway up Naomi's walkway. "That's the house," she said, voice low and urgent in the theatrical way some people reserve for harmless danger. She was not the woman who lives there. Deputy Cole looked toward the lit kitchen window. "Did you see forced entry?" "No, but she was definitely not the owner." "How do you know?" Cheryl hesitated only a fraction. "I know my neighbors." That sentence, like many confident lies, did some of its work precisely because it was so ordinary. At 6:26, there was a hard knock on Naomi's front door. She turned off the faucet, dried her hands on a towel, and walked to the foyer with the mild irritation of someone expecting a package problem or HOA nonsense. When she opened the door, rain hissed in the darkness beyond the porch, and 2 deputies stood there with Cheryl Whitmore just visible near the steps, wrapped in self-importance and drizzle. "Evening," Deputy Cole said. "Can you step outside for me?" Naomi did not move. "For what purpose?" "We got a call about suspicious activity at this property." Naomi blinked once, then looked past him and saw Cheryl. That told her almost everything. "This property," Naomi said, "is my home." Cole's face did not change. "I need you to step outside." "You need a lawful reason for that request." The younger deputy glanced toward Cheryl and then back to the foyer, taking in the framed family photos on the hall table, the umbrella stand, the cardigan hanging on the hook beside the door. Evidence of residence. Ordinary, obvious, sufficient. Cole ignored all of it. "Ma'am, do not make this difficult." Naomi felt anger arrive clean and cold, not because the scene was surprising, because it was banal, because she had spent half her professional life explaining exactly how small acts of unexamined contempt became institutional conduct once a badge and a report gave them shelter. "My name is Dr. Naomi Bennett," she said. "I live here. My identification is on the kitchen counter. You may verify ownership through dispatch or county records without stepping 1 foot farther." Cheryl spoke from behind the deputies. "That's not how she usually talks." Naomi turned her head slightly. "And yet here I am." Cole stepped onto the threshold. That was the moment the encounter hardened. "Outside. Now." Naomi held the door frame with one hand. "No, you have no basis to enter and no basis to remove me." Then Cole did what too many officers did when certainty failed them and performance became necessary. He reached for her wrist. Ramirez said quietly, "Deputy." Too late. Naomi stepped back instinctively, not to flee, but to break the grab. Cole seized that movement the way frightened authority often sees motion, as permission. He caught her arm, twisted it behind her back, and propelled her onto the porch before she could finish the sentence she had started. "Stop resisting." The phrase came out preloaded, as if he had been carrying it waiting for a body to fit it. Naomi's cheek hit the damp porch column. Her left wrist was pinned. Steel closed around the right. Across the property line, Cheryl Whitmore stopped breathing for a moment in the visible way people did when the fantasy they had set in motion became more physical than planned. That was the moment the cold open had begun. "Ma'am, keep your mouth shut and face the wall," Cole said, tightening the cuff. Rainwater ran down Naomi's arm. Her shoulder flared with pain. She could feel every pair of watching eyes on the street, every curtain shifting, every phone deciding whether this was the kind of shame worth preserving digitally. Naomi did not raise her voice. "This is my house," she said. "My name is Dr. Naomi Bennett. The deed is recorded in Fulton County. My driver's license is in my kitchen on the counter because I was cooking dinner. You have no lawful basis to put me in restraints." Cheryl folded her robe tighter. "That is not what I told dispatch." Naomi looked at her. "No, you told them what you needed them to hear." Cole jerked her cuffed hands higher. "You want to talk? You can do it in the car." Naomi felt the pain, logged it, placed it carefully where memory could retrieve it later with timestamps and sequence intact. Then she said, "Since you're so committed to this lie, stand still and listen carefully when I call Governor Ellis." Cole laughed once. "The governor?" "Yes." Cheryl's face changed. Not fully, but enough. The first hairline crack in certainty. Cole looked at Ramirez. "Check the house." Ramirez hesitated. "We should verify with dispatch first." Cole snapped, "Check the house." Ramirez moved toward the doorway, but slower now, eyes taking in the framed degrees in the hall, the brass mail slot with Naomi Bennett engraved beside it, the family portraits lining the wall, the smell of collard greens and garlic still drifting from the kitchen. Reality was all over the place if anybody had wanted it. Naomi looked directly at Ramirez. "Deputy, my phone is on the console table 3 feet inside the door. Put it on speaker." Cole tightened again. "You don't give orders here." Naomi met his eyes. "You are standing on the porch of a woman who briefed the governor on use of force reform 6 hours ago. I am advising you to slow down." That was the first moment Cole's expression shifted from contempt to uncertainty. Not belief. Uncertainty. Sometimes that was enough to destabilize a lie. Cheryl Whitmore, however, was now fully aware something had gone wrong in the universe she preferred. She could be saying anything, she offered weakly. Naomi did not look at her. "Then stay. Listen." Ramirez reached inside, picked up the phone, and brought it out. "Passcode?" Naomi gave it to him. Cole scoffed. "This is ridiculous." "No," Naomi said. "Ridiculous was calling deputies to a house you know belongs to me." Ramirez opened the contact list. Naomi spoke clearly. "Call Martin Ellis." Ramirez blinked once. "Governor Ellis?" "Yes." Cole muttered, "This is insane." But Ramirez, younger and less invested in being right, hit the number. The line rang once. Then the governor answered. "Naomi?" The porch changed temperature. Ramirez froze. Cheryl Whitmore went visibly pale. Deputy Cole's hand slipped off Naomi's arm as if the contact had suddenly become electrified. Naomi kept her voice flat and controlled. "Governor, I'm sorry to interrupt your evening. I'm standing handcuffed on the front porch of my home in Brookhaven Heights because my neighbor falsely reported me as an intruder, and 2 county deputies elected not to verify the residence before restraining me." The rain seemed louder in the silence after that. Governor Ellis's voice came back colder than Naomi had ever heard it. "Who is the supervising officer on scene?" Ramirez swallowed and looked at Cole, who for the first time since arriving appeared to understand the shape of the hole opening beneath him. Naomi answered for them. "Deputy Travis Cole, badge visible. Another deputy present. My neighbor Cheryl Whitmore made the call. I need these cuffs removed immediately, and I need dispatch logs preserved." Cole reached for the cuffs with fingers that were no longer steady. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. Cheryl took one involuntary step backward on the wet brick path. Naomi did not move until both cuffs were off. Only then did she turn to face the 3 of them fully, rubbing one wrist once where the metal had already begun to leave a red groove. Governor Ellis was still on speaker. "Naomi," he said, "do you need medical attention? My shoulder will be sore. My dignity is intact, That will do for now. Cole stared at the porch boards. Ellis said, "The county chief deputy will be calling you within minutes. Do not hang up until I tell you." Naomi almost smiled despite herself. Martin Ellis, for all his caution, knew exactly what the state required theater. "Understood," she said. Then she looked at Cheryl Whitmore, who had lost the wine-glass bravado and now looked like what she was, a woman who had mistaken the machinery of racial suspicion for a harmless extension of neighborhood preference. "You froze faster than they did," Naomi said softly. Cheryl opened her mouth, closed it. There was nothing useful she could say. By 6:41, Chief Deputy Roland Mercer had called twice, the county attorney once, and a patrol supervisor was already en route. Naomi stood inside her foyer now with an ice pack wrapped in a dish towel against her shoulder, still barefoot, cardigan damp at one sleeve, while Ramirez remained on the porch filling the role of the subordinate who had not made the worst choice, but had not stopped it soon enough either. Cole had tried apology once. Naomi had stopped him with one sentence. "Do not reach for comfort before you reach for accuracy." That line would later end up in 2 articles and 1 training bulletin. The street outside had turned into a quiet little amphitheater of suburban conscience. Porch lights glowed. Neighbors stood under awnings, pretending concern had always been their primary feeling. One teenager across the street had very clearly filmed part of the encounter from an upstairs window. Naomi noticed that too and filed it away. Inside, she wrote the timeline on the back of her mail, while events were still hot enough to keep their edges. 6:17 false call, 6:26 knock, 6:28 first physical contact, 6:29 cuffed, 6:31 governor called, 6:33 uncuffed. Specific times mattered. Institutions loved fog. Naomi preferred clocks. Aisha arrived at 6:54 in hospital scrubs and fury. She came through the front door without knocking, took one look at her mother's wrist and said, "Tell me whose career I'm ending first." Naomi, seated now at the kitchen table with the ice pack and her notes, said, "Language." Asha let out one sharp, disbelieving laugh. "No, absolutely not. They put you in cuffs in your own house, and we're still doing tone?" "We are doing sequence," Naomi said. That was how Asha knew her mother was angrier than she sounded. Chief Deputy Mercer arrived at 7:02 with a lieutenant from Internal Affairs, 2 legal pads, and the expression of a man aware he was entering a house where excuses would die on contact. He was white-haired, close to retirement, and smart enough to understand that this was no longer just a bad call. The governor had been on speaker. The neighbor was still next door. The timeline already existed. Mercer began, "Dr. Bennett, on behalf of the department." Naomi lifted one hand. "No speeches. Sit down." He sat. Asha folded her arms by the sink like a prosecutor who had skipped the courtesy phase. Naomi looked at Mercer. "Your deputies responded to a vague, unverified neighbor complaint, ignored visible evidence of residence, crossed a threshold without legal basis, and restrained me before confirming identity. I want the 911 audio preserved, dispatch logs frozen, body camera footage secured, and both deputies separated before they coordinate narratives." Mercer nodded too fast. "Yes, ma'am. I also want the false report referred for review." His eyes flicked briefly toward the front window, where Cheryl's porch light still glowed. "That may depend on prosecutorial discretion," he said carefully. "No," Naomi said. "It depends on whether your office considers weaponized dishonesty an acceptable use of emergency services." That landed. The lieutenant from Internal Affairs started writing faster. Mercer cleared his throat. "Deputy Cole stated you pulled away." "I broke unlawful contact," Naomi said. "Do not dress reflex in the language of resistance." Asha, from the sink, added, "And don't insult us by acting like a wet porch and a frightened black woman somehow produced probable cause." Mercer had the decency to look ashamed then. "Not enough?" "Some." Naomi's phone buzzed again on the table. "Governor Ellis," she answered. "I've spoken with the county manager," he said. "You'll have preservation orders in writing within the hour." "Naomi, I'm sorry." She leaned back in her chair. The house smelled like rain, garlic, and the dinner she was no longer going to finish tonight. "I know you are," she said. "Now help me make it useful." That was the thing about Naomi Bennett. She had learned a long time ago that outrage without structure served the people who caused it more than the people it hurt. The next morning, the clip surfaced. Not the whole thing, just 21 seconds from across the street, shot through an upstairs window by a 16-year-old named Talia Brooks, who had been doing algebra by the front bay window when blue lights lit the rain. The video showed Deputy Cole forcing Naomi against the porch column, and Naomi's voice, calm and carrying, saying, "This is my house." It also captured the moment she said, "Call Governor Ellis." By 8:40 a.m., local news had it. By 10:15, state reporters did too. By noon, the phrase "black woman handcuffed at her own home" was moving through every political office in Georgia like smoke under a door. The title the internet loved was obvious. Neighbor froze when she called the governor. It was a good line, a true line, not the deepest truth. The deepest truth was that Cheryl Whitmore had felt perfectly safe summoning armed men into Naomi Bennett's life before she knew whose name she was gambling with. The governor revealed did not create the injustice. It only stripped away the institution's preferred exit. Naomi spent Friday not in hiding, but in process. She canceled class, took photographs of the bruising on both wrists, had her shoulder examined by an orthopedic colleague at Emory who documented strain and soft tissue injury, sent herself notes by email with timestamps, met by video with 2 attorneys she trusted enough not to waste syllables. Then she sat in her study with the commission's draft police reform report open beside the county's public complaint procedures and began building the record. Aisha brought lunch in anger. "You should sue all of them," she said, dropping Tide takeout on the desk. Naomi kept typing. "That is not mutually exclusive with other options." "Mother." Naomi looked up. "What?" Aisha exhaled. "I know that face. You're already thinking in systems." "Yes." "They put metal on your wrists in your own doorway." "Yes." "And you're talking like this is a policy workshop." Naomi rested her fingers on the keyboard. "Asha, do you know why institutions survive obvious wrongdoing? Because people are cowards? Partly, but mostly because they isolate each event. They make every harm feel singular, personal, regrettable. The second it becomes pattern, the machine gets nervous." Asha sat down opposite her, quieting. Naomi continued, "If this remains about me, it will become a scandal and then a memory. If it becomes about process, training, dispatch discretion, false report enforcement, and threshold entry standards, it has a chance to outlive the news cycle." Asha was her mother's daughter. She hated that the answer was correct. By late afternoon, pattern had begun arriving at Naomi's door, first by email, then by voicemail, then in person. A pastor from Decatur left a message saying his son had been detained on his own porch 2 years earlier after a caller reported someone casing houses. A black couple from Sandy Springs emailed about deputies entering their backyard because a neighbor didn't recognize them planting shrubs. A retired teacher named Mrs. Loretta James arrived Saturday morning with a manila folder of complaint copies dating back 8 years and said, "I believe you may have opened the part of the wall we kept getting pushed back from." Naomi let her in. The folder was not elegant. It was not labeled beautifully, but it held what mattered: names, dates, call summaries, race, neighborhood, outcome, complaint after complaint involving vague, suspicious person calls made by neighbors and escalated by responding officers who treated black presence as probable cause waiting to be written down. There it was again. The box of evidence, the machine metaphor made flesh. By Sunday evening, Naomi had 6 folders, 23 stories, and a stop data researcher from Georgia State volunteering to help categorize them. Governor Ellis called twice that weekend. The first time to apologize again, the second time to ask, "How bad is it?" Naomi stood in her kitchen looking out at the wet garden and said, "Bad enough that if you manage this as an embarrassment instead of a structural failure, you deserve what happens next." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you need?" Naomi did not hesitate. A public preservation order, independent review outside the county, immediate suspensions of Cole pending investigation, and a statewide task force on false emergency reporting tied to racial bias. Ellis exhaled. "That's a lot." "No," Naomi said. "That's the minimum required to prove the state understands the difference between apology and maintenance." By Monday morning, Deputy Travis Cole was on administrative leave. Cheryl Whitmore had retained a lawyer. County dispatch records were under freeze order. The governor had announced an emergency review of neighbor-initiated suspicious person calls and threshold detention policies. And still Naomi knew the public reckoning had not truly begun. Because this was Georgia. Because law enforcement unions knew how to stall. Because local officials loved the word regrettable and hated the word pattern. Because every system preferred to describe its failures as aberrations until paperwork made that impossible. So Naomi went where paperwork could become public. At Wednesday's State House oversight hearing, she testified under oath. No dramatics. No trembling voice. No rhetorical fireworks. Just sequence. She described washing collard greens. Hearing the knock. Seeing Cheryl. Naming the house as hers. Being told to step outside. Being grabbed. Being cuffed. Feeling the rain on the porch rail. Hearing the phrase "stop resisting" before she had meaningfully moved. The committee room stayed very quiet when she got to that part. Then she lifted the folder Mrs. Loretta James had brought her. "This," Naomi said, resting one hand on the worn cardboard, "is not my story alone. It is a sample, which means the question before this committee is no longer whether an error occurred. The question is what kind of system trains officers to trust a racially coded neighbor description more than visible evidence, and what kind of culture teaches certain residents that 911 is an appropriate extension of private bias." A senator on the panel tried the usual move. "Dr. Bennett, with respect, officers often must make rapid judgments in uncertain situations." Naomi looked at him for a long second. "Yes," she said, "and when rapid judgments predictably fall on the same kinds of bodies, that uncertainty has a profile." The room changed after that, not because everyone agreed, because no one in that chamber could pretend the language was still slippery. The county tried to defend itself. Carefully, badly. Their lawyer said the deputies had acted in good faith on the information available. Naomi answered, good faith is not a substitute for basic verification. They said the encounter was brief. She answered, so are house fires. They said Governor Ellis's involvement had politicized an operational matter. She answered, armed misuse of state power is already political. The governor merely heard it sooner than most citizens ever get to. The clip traveled farther after the hearing. So did Naomi's testimony. News anchors began saying phrases like broader pattern and racially coded misuse of emergency services. The county commission called a special meeting. The Attorney General's Civil Rights Unit opened an inquiry. A regional paper published an investigation showing Brookhaven Heights was one of several affluent neighborhoods where suspicious person calls disproportionately targeted black residents returning to, visiting, or working at homes they lawfully occupied. Then came the body cam audit. Naomi had insisted on it because she knew from the commission's work that camera footage did not only reveal action. It revealed sequence, tone, and sometimes motive when official reports got too tidy. The footage from Deputy Cole's camera showed him stepping onto Naomi's threshold before verifying identity. Showed Ramirez hesitating. Showed Cheryl saying, she's not the one who lives there. The owner is more polished. That single word broke the county's first defense clean in half. Polished. Not armed, not violent, not breaking windows. Polished. The kind of adjective prejudice used when it wanted plausible deniability and accidentally told the truth instead. When the footage was played in executive session for the county commission, one member reportedly removed his glasses and said, well, hell. Naomi heard about that later and thought it sounded about right. The public reckoning came in layers, as it always did when the lie had enjoyed institutional shelter. First, Cheryl Whitmore was charged with filing a false emergency report and making materially misleading statements to dispatch. Her lawyer tried to frame it as a misunderstanding fueled by concern. The body cam audio, neighborhood emails, and a history of prior complaints against Naomi about guests and gatherings made that narrative too thin to stand. Then Deputy Cole was terminated, not for one bad night alone, but for unlawful threshold entry, improper use of restraints, false report language, and failure to verify resident identity despite obvious evidence. Ramirez was suspended, then required to testify under oath about the command decisions on scene. Naomi had mixed feelings about him. He had been wrong. He had also looked frightened enough to learn something if the institution around him didn't teach the opposite first. Chief Deputy Mercer announced retirement sooner than planned after internal emails surfaced showing years of dismissed complaints tied to suspicious person calls in affluent districts. Governor Ellis, to his credit, did not try to outrun the moment once it widened. He signed an executive order creating a statewide review panel on emergency call bias, mandatory verification guidance for residence-related intruder calls, and independent audits of discretionary detentions at private homes. Naomi was asked to chair it. She almost laughed. Not because it was absurd, because Georgia was so committed to teaching her in circles. She accepted. At the first press conference after the order, a reporter asked the question everyone expected. "Dr. Bennett, what was going through your mind when you told the deputy to call Governor Ellis?" Naomi stood at the podium in a cream suit, wrists healed but not forgotten, and answered without haste. "I was not thinking about access," she said. "I was thinking about record. Most people being handcuffed at their own homes do not have the governor in their phone. That should disturb all of us more than it impresses any of you." That quote led every evening broadcast in the state, and it was the deepest truth the story had, because Naomi's power had not saved her from the initial harm. It had only accelerated the moment when the lie had to meet resistance. Without her title, her training, her proximity to the governor, she might have spent the night in county lockup under some invented phrase like disorderly obstruction, while Cheryl Whitmore slept cleanly in her own bed. Naomi knew that, so she built the case for people without governors in their contact list. Over the next 3 months, the panel took testimony from 47 residents, reviewed 1,132 suspicious person calls, and found a measurable racial disparity in how often black residents were reported at homes they owned, rented, visited, or lawfully occupied. Deputies were more likely to initiate detention before verification in those cases, more likely to describe ordinary hesitation as noncompliance, more likely to use the phrase matching caller concern when no actual crime had been described. The machine. There it was again, in columns and percentages this time. Naomi's final report was 92 pages long, and plain-spoken enough to make everybody angrier than a more diplomatic document would have. She recommended criminal penalties for repeated false emergency calls, motivated by bias. Mandatory property record verification before threshold detention when feasible. Clear limits on handcuff use absent articulable threat. Automatic review of all neighbor-initiated suspicious person calls resulting in physical contact. And public dashboards broken down by race, neighborhood, and call type. A sheriff from the northern part of the state called the report urban overreach. Naomi responded, "Then stop overreaching on urban porches." That line got applause in a hearing room where applause was technically forbidden. At home, the aftermath was quieter and stranger. For 2 weeks, Naomi flinched at hard knocks she had not invited. For a month, she kept her license in the same ceramic bowl by the door and hated herself for the concession. Asha came for dinner twice a week instead of once and pretended it was because residency had magically improved. Her grandson Malik asked why Grandma had silver bracelets from bad police, and Naomi sat on the floor with him and answered more honestly than some adults would have preferred. "Because some people believed a lie before they believed me," she said. He considered that with 4-year-old seriousness. "Did you win?" Naomi looked at him, then at Asha in the kitchen doorway, listening too quietly. "We're still working," she said. That was the right answer. Because justice, as Naomi understood better than most, was not the thrill of watching Cheryl Whitmore led through processing or Deputy Cole hand over his badge. It was not the headline or the hearing or the governor saying her name into a phone line grown suddenly cold with panic. Justice was the restoration of terms. It was forcing the machine to name itself. It was making the next black woman on the next wet porch slightly less available to disbelief. 6 months later, Naomi planted new hydrangeas along the walk where the rain had torn up the soil during that ugly spring week of cameras and officials and neighbors rediscovering their consciences in public. The afternoon was bright, warm, and ordinary. Asha was there in jeans and gardening gloves she was using incorrectly. Malik stomped in a patch of mud he had been explicitly asked to avoid. Jazz played softly from the kitchen speaker through the open window. Across the property line, Cheryl Whitmore's house sat empty. Sold in May. Quiet ever since. A new couple had moved in 3 weeks earlier. They brought lemon bars the first weekend, introduced themselves properly, and never once behaved as if Naomi's existence required interpretation. That mattered too. Naomi pressed soil around the roots of the second hydrangea and leaned back on her heels. Her wrists were bare. The porch gleamed in late sun. The same steps, the same columns, the same front door, transformed not by forgetting, but by surviving long enough to repossess the place. Asha came up beside her and handed over the small trowel. You know, she said, most people would have moved. Naomi brushed dirt from her palms. Most people shouldn't have to choose between safety and surrender. Asha nodded. After a moment, she asked, do you still think about that night every time it rains? Naomi looked toward the street where Malik was now narrating his own imaginary construction project to a worm. Yes, she said. Then, after a pause, less like fear now, more like instruction. Asha smiled a little. That sounds like you. Naomi stood, one hand resting briefly on the porch rail where the steel had once clicked shut around her wrists. Warm wood now. Sunlight. No sirens. No shouting. Just birds in the crepe myrtle. A child in the yard. Dinner waiting to be finished inside. The quiet that wrapped around the house was not the quiet before the storm. It was the quiet after a machine had been forced, however briefly, to stop and look at itself. And in that pause, something had shifted. Not enough. Never enough, but real. Naomi picked up the watering can and moved to the next plant. Inside, collard greens were simmering again. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.